The AI standard surface can look a bit intimidating, but in this video we are going to demystify the settings you need. Like with many things in Maya, you have far more options than you actually need. For the vast majority of the cases, you will really only need a few select one of these. You can see there are so many menus and there are so many different settings for each menu, which is fantastic because it allows you to have perfect control over everything, but it's also really annoying if you're a beginner and you think you have to understand everything. So in this video, we are going to cover the attributes you really need and really trying to understand how the shader works. Before that, here is a link which comes along in the PDF. This is made by Substance, where they're talking about PBR, basically how does light behave when it comes to the shader. This is, I would say, absolutely essential reading for anyone who wants to understand how the shader actually works. The Arnold shader works based on these principles, and all modern shaders will do the same thing. For instance, if you want to understand how roughness works, you should really try to understand what's going on here. We're not actually supplying this PDF in the tutorial because it's not ours to supply, but we're supplying a link to it. So I recommend that before you get too deep into this, that you have at least you skim through this document, and then you keep revisiting it as when you keep learning more about shaders. My shading improved dramatically once I started to understand some of these concepts. So with that said, let's start to look into some of the most common attributes. The most basic one is color. This is essentially what color is the object. Here you can see if we make it red, it's going to be a red object. There is a lot of balancing going on under the hood. If you use shaders beforehand, you knew you had to start to balance the input and output of how much energy was received. This is all done under the hood. The only thing you really have to worry about in this case is what color do you want the object to be? Then we'll select that color. This can also be controlled via texture map as well, but for now we are just going to be dealing with the color. So color, very simple. We can also change the weight of it as well. I prefer to just leave this at the default, but in specific cases you might actually have to change the weight as well. If you set this all the way to 1, you can see the color becomes stronger, and if we set this all the way to 0, it becomes black, meaning that this color does absolutely nothing. Then we'll look into metalness, and here you can see why it's clever to name your shaders. With metalness, we're essentially saying, is this metal? Yes or no? In this case, yes. Now you can see it just looks like metal. Again, bunch of complex computations under the hood, but in terms of an interface, we just say yes or no. One thing to keep in mind here is that we very rarely would have values in between. Sometimes you might want to get a little bit in there just to get a bit higher contrast perhaps, but in general, if you want properly authored materials, you stick to either yes or no. Then let's look into specularity. With the specularity, with this shader, we are actually using metalness just to keep it a bit stronger and so a bit easier to see. We change generally the specularity, the specular amount, using the roughness slot. If you come from an old school method of doing CG, you might have been dealing with the specular amount, but we're not going to be doing that. That would break the physicality of it, and this is not what makes something more or less shiny. What makes something more or less shiny is the specular roughness. So we set this all the way down to 0. You can see that now the reflection becomes incredibly sharp. We have these really sharp and nice reflections. And we set this all the way to 1. You can see it's almost a completely dull object. What's happening is fully described in the document I just linked to. But what's essentially happening is that there is a bunch of micro faceting going on. Imagine if you have a really clear sea, so the waves are really nice and smooth. It's going to be highly reflective. But imagine if you have a lot of small waves, it's barely going to look reflective at all. And that's what's happening here as well. This is happening on a micro level. So in short, if you want to be super reflective, have a low value. If you want something to not be reflective at all, have a very high value. It goes between 0 and 1. Everything has reflections. Every single object in the world will have some level of reflection to it. A human has actually quite a lot of reflections, so just start to observe this. Next up, we are looking at transmission. Transmission is a fancy way of saying refractions, which is a fancy way of saying transparency. It's not actual transparency in the way that it becomes more or less like the opacity goes up and down. There's a bunch more things happening. For instance, if you were to see a glass, you wouldn't. It's not just transparent; it's refractive. It actually bends the light. Cool tip is you can click directly in the render view, and that will select the shader. So this is not just like a dull image. This is a live view. So now we can just click on the shader, and now we have transmission. And we find transmission under, well, transmission. And now what happens when we set the weight up? You can see there are two little balls hiding inside. And this just makes it look like it's transparent. And now you can see through it. So one of these is actually inside and one of these is on the back. If we want to change the amount the light bends, we have to do that under specularity, and we have to do this under ROI. The ROI will affect basically how strong the reflection is and also how strong the refraction is. So we set this back to 1. You can see that it just looks fully transparent now. The light doesn't bend at all. The light goes in at the exact same angle, the light goes out. We set it to 2. Now it is even more, it bends it even more. Different materials have different properties. And if we click next to, see there's a little drop down here. Now we can click this and we can get a correct ROI, index of refraction, by just clicking on these presets. The only thing this is doing, it actually just inputs a number. It doesn't actually do anything fancy. It doesn't read from a diamond database or anything like that. The only thing it's doing is it just knows the ROI of different objects. So for instance, diamond has a crazy ROI because it's such an insane material. So in this case, if you're doing a diamond, you should set this to 2.4. Or if you're doing like cornea, it's 1.7, which is quite low. And if you're doing glass, you have to set this to the ROI of glass. Essentially, this determines how much the light will distort. If it has an ROI of 1, it will just go straight through. Or if it has an ROI of something else, it will bend in different ways when it actually hits the light. We can also change the weight as well. This is how much of this, like essentially how strong is the transmission. If we set it all the way up, then it's fully transmissive. If we set it all the way down, then it's fully opaque. You can also change the color of it as well. So if you want like a colored glass, if you want like a red glass, we can do that. We can just set it back to white. And what's interesting about transmission as well is it's so highly dependent on the glass as well. In this case, you can see it's fully transparent, and that's because the roughness is set to 0. So transmission and specularity, they go hand in hand. So let's see what happens when we were to increase the roughness of this. Now you can see that the specularity becomes a lot duller, so that it, instead of having these incredibly sharp reflections, it actually becomes a lot duller, but also the refraction, the transmission amount as well. So now it becomes more of a frosted glass. And this is what I mean with Arnold, that a lot of this is done under the hood. In earlier days, we would have to do this manually, and we wouldn't have physically plausible lights. You can't have a material which has a low roughness for specularity and it has a high roughness for transmission. It just doesn't work like that. Frosted glass will be rough in reflections and it will be rough in the transmission amount as well. So this just keeps it a lot easier. It just means that whatever settings you're using is probably going to be physically plausible. Then let's look into subsurface scattering. This is what we'll use for if we're doing organic models like this. What's really important about subsurface scattering, which is not that important with the other shaders, is that this here is based on scale. We find subsurface under subsurface. And here we can change the weight from nothing at all to fully subsurface. We can also change the color. This is where you would, if you're doing this properly, you would actually input texture maps, which are properly painted. But now you can just see what this actually does. So changing the subsurface color has dramatic results. We can also change the radius. In our case, we used a color for this, but this is really what is the actual radius like. So if you set this to a really high value, it's going to look way more waxy. Or if you set it to a lower value, it's going to look way more like skin. So we want this here to be a bit higher as well. So now you can see that there is some nice subsurface scattering around the ears and just around the different areas where there would be subsurface. It's really tricky to find good subsurface values because it's very easy that either it's far too low, meaning that it doesn't look anything like skin, it looks more like wood, or it's far too high and it looks way more like wax. I find that most people tend to make it look far more like wax than like wood, and it's all based on these settings. You can also change the scale as well. So for instance, if you were to model in 1/10 of a scale, you could set the scale up or you can set the scale down as well. Then we have random walk. Basically, you should use either random walk or random walk 2. This just gives you vastly more accurate subsurface scattering. There's been a real revolution when it comes to subsurface scattering and using random walk. Usually we had to have separate subsurface shaders and they were all kind of terrible. But through the addition of random walk, which is making its way across all the 3D software, you can now get very accurate subsurface scattering and very accurate shading directly, or skin shading directly using the AI standard surface. So I highly recommend that you use this. I use this personally for my personal project. All my friends who do VFX and they're doing all sorts of crazy realistic characters, they're using this shader directly instead of using skin shaders or anything like that. If you're noticing, there isn't actually a skin shader in Arnold. That's all been deprecated because this just takes over as one master shader. And then we have emission. Emission just means that we have something which will be glowing. So if we select the cube, then we go to emission, and then we go down to emission. We can now set the color to be higher than, well, black. Black will do nothing. And then we can set this to be a specific color. And this will just make it glow. Higher the weight, the more it's going to be glowing as well. You can see here how intense it actually gets compared from 5 to 1. So if you want one specific object to glow, this is super handy. Imagine you're doing something like the Thanos gauntlet, and you want some of the rings to start glowing, you could easily do that here. Instead of using lights to make something glow, you can use actual objects. This is what happens a lot. If you have something which, like metal, which turns incredibly bright because it's being heated up or something like that. You don't want to have a light. You don't want to actually shine a light on it. You want the object itself to glow. So you can see here that even though we have a million different inputs and so many different things, it's really not that complicated to use this shader. In short, we are simply dealing with what is the color, what is the roughness value, basically how shiny or how dull is the material. We have an index of refraction, which determines how bright the reflection is, and also how much the light is scattering if you're using transmission. Transmission, which will determine how transparent the object is. Subsurface, which will determine if light is actually scattering into the object. And then we have emission, which tells Arnold, is this a glowing material or not?